You're not going to believe this story. It's one of those tales that starts in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, with a girl running for her life. But where it ends, well, that's the part that'll keep you up at night. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about secrets buried so deep they could poison the ground. And it starts with a single, desperate knock on a stranger's door in the heart of a storm. The forest was a monster, all teeth and claws in the dark. Every branch that whipped across Rose's face felt like her father's hand, and every crack of thunder sounded like his voice roaring her name. She'd been running for hours, her lungs burning, the mud sucking at her worn-out shoes. But she didn't dare stop. She couldn't. Not with what she'd taken. Tucked inside her dress, pressed against her bruised ribs, was a small leather-bound journal. Her mother's journal. And it was the one thing her father wanted more than his next bottle of whiskey. He'd torn the house apart looking for it tonight, his rage finally boiling over. And when he'd turned that rage on her, she knew she had to run. She had to take it with her. Now the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the world into a black, roaring mess. She was freezing, lost, and about to give up. She was ready to just lie down and let the forest swallow her whole. And that's when she saw it. A light. A tiny wavering flicker of gold through the thick curtain of pine trees. Hope shot through her, so sharp and painful it almost brought her to her knees. A cabin. Someone lived out here, this deep in the woods. The folks in town always whispered about the people who lived off the grid. Said they were outlaws, madmen, or worse. But what choice did she have? Go back to her father's fists, or risk the mercy of a stranger? She stumbled toward the light, her legs shaking, her mind numb with cold and fear. The cabin was small, built of dark, heavy logs, with a thin curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney, fighting against the rain. It looked like it had grown right out of the earth. She hesitated for only a second, then raised a trembling hand and knocked. 3 quick raps that were swallowed by the storm. She waited. Nothing. She knocked again, harder this time, putting all of her remaining strength into it. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind screaming through the trees. Then she heard a heavy footstep inside. A bolt scraped back, loud and final. The door creaked open. He was a shadow, a silhouette against the warm firelight inside. Taller than she expected, broad, with a stillness about him that was more intimidating than any noise. His hair was long and dark, tied back with a simple leather cord. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, and his eyes were like polished river stones, gray and unreadable. They took her in, from her torn dress to her bare, muddy feet, and she felt a new kind of fear, colder than the rain. This was a mistake, a terrible mistake. She should have stayed in the woods. I'm lost, she stammered, her voice a thin whisper. The storm. I just need a place to wait it out. Just for the night. I'll be gone by morning, I swear. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his expression giving nothing away. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until she was sure he was going to slam the door in her face. Then without a word, he gave a short, sharp nod and stepped aside, holding the door open. She scrambled inside, dripping water and mud onto the clean planked floor. The warmth hit her like a physical blow, a wave of comfort so intense it made her dizzy. The cabin was one room, neat and sparse. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a fire crackling merrily inside. There was a simple table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed tucked into the far corner. Tools lined the walls, clean and orderly. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else. Something like old leather and rain. He closed the door, shutting out the storm, and the sudden quiet was deafening. He pointed a thumb toward the bed. "You take that," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "I'll take the floor." Rose clutched the journal hidden in her dress, her knuckles white. She was safe from the storm, yes. But a new question burned in her mind. Had she just traded one monster for another? She didn't sleep. How could she? She lay on the narrow cot, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket he'd given her, and listened. She listened to the rain drumming on the roof. She listened to the fire hiss and pop. And most of all, She listened to the man on the other side of the room. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't offered his. He'd simply laid a bedroll near the hearth, sat down with his back against the wall, and started sharpening a long, wicked-looking knife. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound in the cabin, a constant, unnerving reminder that she was trapped here with a complete stranger. A very large, very quiet stranger with a very sharp knife. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face twisted with rage. Then she'd see the stranger's face, blank and unreadable, and she wasn't sure which was worse, the devil you know or the one you don't. Hours crawled by. The storm began to ease, the thunder rolling further and further away. The scraping sound stopped. Rose held her breath, every muscle tense. She heard him shift, the soft rustle of his bedroll. Was he asleep? She waited, counting heartbeats in the dark. Finally, her own exhaustion started to win. Her eyelids grew heavy. Maybe she was wrong about him. Maybe he was just a lonely man who valued his quiet. Maybe he was kind. Her body finally gave in, and she drifted into a restless, dream-haunted sleep. She woke with a gasp. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Something was wrong. The air was different, colder. She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. And then she saw it. The door to the cabin was wide open, and the man was gone. Panic seized her. Had he left her here, or was he coming back with friends? Her hand flew to the journal. It was still there. She scrambled off the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wood floor, and crept to the open doorway. She peered out into the pre-dawn gloom. The rain had stopped, and a thick fog clung to the ground, swallowing the trees. There was no sign of him. Where could he have gone? She was about to retreat back into the warmth of the cabin when a sound made her freeze. A low murmur. Voices. They were coming from somewhere in the fog, just beyond the edge of the clearing. She couldn't make out the words, but there were at least two people. Her blood ran cold. He hadn't just left. He was out there talking to someone. Had he gone to town to report her? Was the sheriff on his way? She had to hide. She had to get the journal somewhere safe. Her eyes darted around the small cabin. There was nowhere to go. No closets, no cellars, just the one room. But then her gaze fell on something she hadn't noticed before. Behind a stack of firewood near the hearth, almost completely hidden in the shadows, was another door. A small, low door, barely visible against the dark wood of the wall. It wasn't a door to the outside. It was a door to somewhere inside the cabin. Her curiosity warred with her fear. Where did it lead? Without a second thought, she crossed the room, moved the firewood, and pulled on the small iron ring that served as a handle. The door was locked. Of course, it was locked. Frantic, she looked around for something to pry it open. Her eyes landed on the knife he'd been sharpening, left on the mantel above the fireplace. She grabbed it, the steel cool and heavy in her hand, and jammed the tip into the crack of the door. With a grunt, she put her weight into it. The old wood groaned, splintered, and then gave way with a sharp crack. The door swung inward, revealing a flight of steep, narrow steps leading down into darkness. It was a root cellar. The air that rose up smelled of damp earth and secrets. She had to hide the journal. This was the perfect place. She took a deep breath, and holding the knife in front of her, she stepped down into the black. The steps were rough-hewn, slick with damp. She took them one at a time, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. When her feet touched the dirt floor, she paused, letting her eyes adjust. A faint gray light filtered through a small grate near the ceiling. It wasn't a cellar. Not just a cellar. It was a room, a hidden room, and it wasn't for storing potatoes. Along one wall were shelves, but they weren't filled with preserves. They were filled with books, ledgers, and maps. Maps of the entire county, with red lines and strange symbols drawn all over them. On another wall, tacked up with nails, were sketches, drawings, faces. Her blood turned to ice. She recognized the faces. There was the sheriff. There was Judge Sterling, the man who owned half the town. And there, sketched with angry, brutal lines, was her father. This wasn't a hideout. It was a command center. This man, this quiet stranger, wasn't just a hermit. He was hunting them, and that's when she heard the footsteps on the floorboards above her. He was back, and he was not alone. "I told you, she came out of the storm," she heard his low voice from above. "A kid, scared, nothing more." Another voice answered, one that made her stomach clench with fear. It was the town sheriff, a man named Gable, a man who did whatever Judge Sterling told him to. "A scared kid who ran off with something that belongs to the judge's man Whitmore," Gable sneered. "We tracked her this far. You're sure you ain't seen a girl, Sam?" Sam. So that was his name. Rose pressed herself against the cold dirt wall, trying to make herself invisible. She held her breath, praying they wouldn't find her, praying they wouldn't see the broken lock on the cellar door. "I told you," Sam said, his voice flat. "No one's here but me. You're wasting your time." There was a long, tense silence. Rose could hear the floorboards creaking as the sheriff walked around the cabin. She could picture him, poking into corners, his suspicious eyes scanning everything. "Funny," Sheriff Gable said slowly. "This fire's been burning hot, and there are 2 mugs on the table. You expecting company, Sam?" Rose's heart stopped. He'd seen the evidence of her. It was over. They were going to find her. "I like my coffee," Sam replied, his voice still impossibly calm. "Sometimes I use 2 mugs." "Uh-huh," the sheriff grunted, more creaking. He was getting closer to the cellar door. "Well, you see anything, you let me know. Judge Sterling is offering a reward, a big one." The floorboards groaned one last time, right above her head. Then she heard the heavy thud of boots moving away, toward the front door. The door opened, then closed. She waited, not daring to breathe, until she heard the sound of horses riding away. He was gone. The sheriff was gone. She was safe. For now. Relief washed over her, so powerful it made her legs weak. She sagged against the wall, the knife clattering from her hand onto the dirt floor. And then she heard a new sound, the sound of firewood being moved from in front of the cellar door. A sliver of light appeared as the door creaked open. Sam's silhouette filled the frame, blocking out the light. He stood there for a long moment, just looking down at her in the dark. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel his anger, cold and sharp as the knife at her feet. "You," he said, and his voice was no longer calm. It was a low, dangerous growl. "You have no idea what you've done." He didn't yell. He didn't have to. The quiet fury in his eyes was worse than any shouting. He came down the steps, his movements sure and silent, like a predator. He picked up the knife she'd dropped, his eyes never leaving hers. Rose scrambled backwards until her back hit the damp wall. I was scared," she whispered. "I heard voices. I thought you'd turn me in." "So you broke into my home," he said, his voice dangerously low. He gestured around the hidden room with the tip of the knife. "Into this?" She stared at the maps, the sketches of her father and the sheriff. "Who are you?" she breathed. "What is all this?" He ignored her question. He took a step closer, and she flinched. His eyes dropped to her hands, which were clutching the front of her dress, protecting the journal. "What did you take?" he demanded. "The sheriff said you stole something. What is it?" Rose hesitated. This man was a stranger, a man who was clearly involved in something deep and dangerous. The sketches on the wall proved that. He was the enemy of her enemy, but that didn't make him her friend. But what choice did she have? She was trapped in a cellar with him. Lying would be stupid. Slowly, she pulled the small leather journal from its hiding place. "This," she said, holding it out. "It was my mother's." Sam's eyes fixed on the journal. He didn't take it. For a moment, his anger seemed to fade, replaced by a strange, intense curiosity. He just stared at the worn leather cover, as if he recognized it. "Let me see it," he said, his voice softer now, but still a command. She handed it to him. He took it, his rough fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the cover. He opened it to a random page. His eyes scanned the delicate, looping handwriting. Rose watched his face, trying to read his expression. He was completely still, his jaw tight. He seemed to be holding his breath. What did he see? The book was mostly just recipes and notes about planting seasons. Little bits of her mother's daily life, or so she had thought. "My father," Rose explained, her voice trembling. "He wanted it. He went crazy when he couldn't find it. That's why I ran." Sam didn't seem to hear her. He kept turning the pages, his eyes darting back and forth. Then he stopped. He froze on one particular page. He stared at it for a full minute, his knuckles white where he gripped the book. Then he looked up at her. The anger was gone. So was the curiosity. In their place was something she couldn't name, something that looked almost like recognition or shock. "The storm," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The recipe for honey storm cakes. Page 34. What does the last ingredient say?" Rose frowned, confused by the strange question. I I don't know. Flour, honey, buttermilk. I think the last one is just cinnamon." "No," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "It's not. Look again." He held the book out to her. She took it, her hands shaking, and turned to page 34. There it was, her mother's familiar recipe. She read the list of ingredients aloud. Flour, honey, buttermilk, 2 eggs, a pinch of salt, and a dash of cinnamon. She looked up at him, confused. "See? Cinnamon. Read the note at the bottom of the page," he commanded. Her eyes dropped to the bottom. There, in smaller, fainter script, was a little note her mother had written to herself. "Don't forget the last spice, the one from Mr. Sterling's private stock. It makes all the difference." Mr. Sterling? Judge Sterling? Why would her mother be getting spices from him? It didn't make any sense. "It's a code," Sam said, watching her face. "Your mother was a very clever woman." He reached out and gently took the journal back from her. He turned to another page, one with a recipe for riverbank stew. "Look at the first letter of each ingredient," he said. Rose leaned closer. R. Oots, I. Ron potatoes. V. Innocent. E. elderberries. R. Rosemary. River. It's spelled river. Her breath hitched in her throat. "What does it mean?" "It's a map," Sam said, his voice low with a new urgency. "All of it. The recipes, the notes. They aren't about cooking. They're a map and a ledger. A record of every crime Judge Sterling and his men have committed in this valley for the last 10 years. Rose stared at him, her mind reeling. Her mother? A spy? It was impossible. Her mother was a simple, kind woman who loved to bake and tend her garden. She wouldn't be involved in something like this. And yet, the proof was right there, in her own hands. "But why?" Rose whispered. "Why would she do this?" Sam's gray eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of old pain in them. "Because Judge Sterling took everything from her," he said, "just like he took everything from me." "Sterling drove my people from this land," Sam said, his voice a low rumble of long-buried anger. "He called it progress. I called it theft. My mother, she spoke out against him. She tried to warn the townsfolk, but they wouldn't listen. They were too afraid of him. One night our home was burned to the ground. We were forced to flee into the mountains in the dead of winter." He paused, his jaw working. "She didn't survive the cold. I was just a boy." Rose stared at him, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. The hidden room, the sketches, the years of watching, waiting. This wasn't just about justice for him. It was about revenge. "And my mother?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "She was your mother's friend," Sam said. "They grew up together. After my mother died, yours decided she couldn't stay silent. But she was smarter. She knew she couldn't fight Sterling out in the open. So she watched. She listened. And she wrote everything down, right under their noses, in a language they would never understand." He tapped the journal. "This book is Sterling's doom. It details every land deal he rigged, every man he paid off, every crime he covered up. It even details the night he had my family's home burned. Your mother was going to take it to the federal marshals, but she never got the chance." Rose felt the blood drain from her face. "Her accident," she began. "The wagon that overturned on the Ridge Road." "It was no accident," Sam finished, his voice grim. "Sterling found out she had proof against him. He and your father arranged the whole thing. They killed her, Rose. They killed her and made it look like she lost control of the horses." The world tilted on its axis. The floor beneath her seemed to fall away. her father, her own father. He hadn't just become a monster after her mother died. He'd been one all along. The man who had raised her, who had tucked her in at night as a child, was a murderer. The man who had just tried to beat her for this very journal. He wasn't afraid of what was in it. He was terrified. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. The bruises on her ribs ached with a new, deeper pain. All these years, she'd been living with her mother's killer. He told me he couldn't live without her, she choked out. He said the grief drove him to the bottle. He was drinking to forget what he did, Sam said, his voice softer now, the anger replaced by a quiet sympathy. But men like him and Sterling, they never forget, and they never stop. Now they know you have the journal. They won't stop until they get it back, and until they silence you, just like they silenced your mother. The full weight of her situation crashed down on her. She wasn't just a runaway anymore. She was a witness, the only witness. And she was hiding in the home of the one other person in the world who wanted to see Judge Sterling pay for his crimes. The hunter had become the hunted, and her only ally was a man with a dark past and a thirst for vengeance that mirrored her own. They were no longer just two strangers in a storm. They were the last two people alive who knew the truth, and the wolves were closing in. They spent the next few hours in the hidden room, a candle flickering between them, casting their shadows long and twisted on the walls. Sam, it turned out, had suspected the journal's true nature for years. He'd known Rose's mother was working against Sterling, but he'd never known the form her evidence took. Now, with the journal in his hands, he began to cross-reference the coded recipes with his own maps and notes. It was like watching a master locksmith pick a complicated lock. "A pinch of Salt Creek salt," he'd murmur, turning to a map. "That means the old salt lick down by the creek. She's saying that's where Sterling buried the man who wouldn't sell his land." "Let the dough rise until it doubles," Rose read over his shoulder. "That was the night they doubled the guards at the mine after the cave-in they caused," Sam confirmed, pointing to a date in one of his own ledgers. It was a gruesome puzzle, and every piece they put together painted a darker picture of the evil that had taken root in the valley. Rose's grief was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was quickly being forged into something else, something hot and sharp. Rage. They had to get the journal to the authorities. But how? Sheriff Gable was in Sterling's pocket. The nearest federal marshal was 100 miles away, a journey they'd never survive with Sterling's men hunting them. "We're trapped," Rose said, the reality of it sinking in. "They know I came this way. They'll be back." "Let them come," Sam said, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. "This cabin has more than one way out. And these woods, I know them better than they know the back of their own hands. This is my home ground. We have the advantage here." There was a new energy in him. For years he'd been a ghost, haunting the edges of the society that had wronged him. He'd been gathering information, planning, but he'd been missing the one thing that could bring it all together: the journal. Rose had, by sheer accident, delivered the key right to his door. But before they could make a plan, they heard it. A dog barking, far off in the woods but getting closer. Then another. Sterling wasn't sending the sheriff this time. He was sending hired men, trackers. They were out of time. "Go," Sam said, his voice urgent. He grabbed a worn leather satchel and began shoving the journal, a few of his own ledgers, and a small pouch into it. "There's a passage at the back of the cellar. It leads to an old creek bed. Follow it north. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" Rose cried, her heart seizing with a new fear. She didn't want to leave him. "I'll lead them away," he said, grabbing a long hunting rifle from a rack on the wall. "Buy you some time. Go. Now." He pushed the satchel into her hands. "Don't lose that book. It's the only thing that matters." He looked at her then, his gray eyes intense. "Your mother was a brave woman, Rose. Be her daughter now." He turned and ran up the stairs without a backward glance. Rose stood frozen for a second, the weight of the satchel heavy in her hands. She heard the cabin door above slam open. Shouts. The bark of a rifle. Snapping out of her fear, she turned and ran. She found the opening, a narrow gap in the rock behind a stack of old barrels, and squeezed through. She was in a tight, dark tunnel that smelled of wet earth. She crawled on her hands and knees, the satchel bumping against her back. Behind her, she heard a muffled crash, more shouting, and then another gunshot, this one closer. She didn't know if Sam was alive or dead. All she knew was that she had to keep moving. She was the keeper of the truth now, the last echo of her mother's courage, and she would not let them extinguish it. She crawled faster, the darkness absolute, the sound of her own ragged breath loud in her ears. The fate of the entire valley was in the satchel on her back, and she was running for her life. The tunnel was a nightmare of tight spaces and suffocating darkness. It twisted and turned, scraping her knees raw. More than once, she thought she'd hit a dead end, only to find the passage continuing at a sharp angle. She had no idea how long she'd been crawling, but it felt like an eternity. The sounds from the cabin had faded, replaced by the thumping of her own heart. Was Sam okay? Had he managed to get away? Or had he sacrificed himself for her, a girl he'd only just met? The thought was a spike of ice in her gut. She had to keep moving, for him, for her mother. Finally, she saw a faint circle of gray light ahead. The exit. She scrambled toward it, hope and fear warring in her chest. She pushed aside a thick curtain of roots and tumbled out onto the muddy bank of a creek bed, gasping in the cool, damp air. The fog was even thicker here, a ghostly blanket that muffled all sound. Which way was north? She looked around, disoriented, and then she heard the snapping of a twig. She froze, her body instantly rigid. The sound had come from just upstream, no more than 20 feet away. Someone was there, hidden in the fog. Was it one of Sterling's men? Had they found the tunnel exit? She held her breath, straining to listen. Silence. Had she imagined it? No. There it was again, the soft crunch of a boot on gravel. They were trying to be quiet. They were hunting. Her hand instinctively went for the knife Sam had given her, its handle a small, solid comfort in her pocket. She backed away slowly, trying to melt back into the shadows of the creek bank. She had to run, but if she made a sound, they'd be on her in a second. She took one step back, then another. Her foot came down on a loose pile of stones. They skittered and clattered, the sound echoing loud as a gunshot in the silent fog. A figure emerged from the mist, rifle raised. But it wasn't one of Sterling's men, it was Sam. Relief hit her so hard her knees buckled. He was alive. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was a dark smear of blood on his cheek. But he was alive. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes wide and urgent, and pointed downstream. He didn't have to say a word. They were being followed. He grabbed her hand, his grip strong and sure, and pulled her along. They ran. They didn't follow the creek bed, which would be too obvious. Instead, Sam plunged into the thickest part of the forest, moving with a speed and silence that was astonishing. He seemed to know every tree, every rock, every hidden path. He led her on a dizzying, twisting route, doubling back on their trail, wading through freezing streams to hide their scent. Rose's lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead, but she refused to fall behind. She held onto his hand like it was her only anchor in the world. After what felt like hours, he finally stopped, pulling her down behind a massive moss-covered boulder. "We rest here," he breathed, his chest heaving. "They'll have the dogs out soon, but the water should confuse them for a while." "Are you hurt?" Rose asked, looking at the blood on his face. "It's a scratch," he dismissed. "They burned the cabin." The words hung in the air between them. His home, the place he had hidden for years. Gone. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He just shook his head, his face a grim mask. "It was just wood and stone. We have what matters." He tapped the satchel she was still clutching. He pulled a piece of dried venison from his pocket and handed it to her. "Eat. We need our strength." As she chewed the tough, salty meat, the full desperation of their situation settled in. They were fugitives, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a book full of secrets. They were being hunted by a man who owned the law and had an army of trackers at his command. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We can't outrun them forever." "We don't have to," Sam said. He pulled one of the maps from the satchel. Even in the dim forest light, Rose could see it was different from the others. It was older. The paper yellowed and cracked. "Sterling thinks these woods are his," he said. a strange grim smile touching his lips. But this land remembers my people. There are places in these mountains that his men don't know exist. Old places. He pointed to a symbol on the map, a drawing of a cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall. We go here. It's a day's journey if we're careful. From there, we can plan our next move. It was a sliver of hope, but it was enough. As they prepared to move out, Sam paused. He looked at her, his expression serious. They will not show you mercy if they catch you, Rose. You understand that, right? She nodded, her throat tight. I understand. Good, he said. He reached into his boot and pulled out a small, bone-handled pistol. It was old but well cared for. He checked the load, then handed it to her. I hope you don't have to use this, he said, his voice low and steady. But if they corner you, if I'm not there, do not let them take you alive. Do you hear me? Do not let them take that journal. Rose looked down at the gun in her hand. The cold, heavy weight of it was a terrible promise. The girl who had run from her father's house just a day ago was gone. In her place was someone she didn't recognize. Someone holding a gun, ready to use it. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and terror. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Sam was a ghost in the woods, leading her through terrain so rough and wild she never would have attempted it on her own. He read the signs of the forest like a book, pointing out where their pursuers had passed, how long ago, and which way they were headed. He was always one step ahead. They moved mostly at night, resting during the day in hidden hollows or thickets so dense the sunlight couldn't penetrate. They ate sparingly, drank from mountain springs, and rarely spoke, conserving their energy. During one of their brief rests, huddled under a rocky overhang as a cold rain fell, Rose finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Why did you help me? She whispered. That first night. You didn't know who I was. You could have just turned me away. Sam stared out into the rain for a long time before he answered. When you knocked on my door, he said slowly, you had the same look in your eyes that my mother had the day they burned our home. Fear, but not just fear. Defiance. You weren't just running from something. You were running to something. You just didn't know what it was yet. He looked at her, his gaze steady. I didn't help you, Rose. I recognized you. The simple words hit her harder than any blow. In that moment, she understood that their meeting hadn't been an accident. It was fate, a convergence of two lives shattered by the same man, now bound together by a shared purpose. She wasn't alone in this fight, and neither was he. The bond between them, forged in fear and fire, solidified into something unbreakable. They were a team, the last remnants of a resistance her own mother had started. Late on the second night, they heard the dogs again, closer this time. Sterling's men were relentless. They were gaining. They're pushing us toward the river, Sam said, his voice tight with concern. It's a trap. They'll have men waiting on the other side. So what do we do? Rose asked, her hand straying to the pistol tucked in her belt. We don't cross the river, he said. We go under it. He led her to a part of the forest where the ground grew marshy and the trees were thick with hanging moss. Hidden behind a curtain of vines was a dark, narrow opening at the base of a rock face. It looked like an animal den. An old lava tube, Sam explained. It runs for miles. Comes out on the other side of the ridge, well beyond the river. It will be our best chance. The entrance was barely wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, it was pitch black and freezing cold. The air was thin and smelled of minerals and decay. They had to crawl, the rough volcanic rock tearing at their clothes. It was claustrophobic, terrifying. It felt like being buried alive. Rose fought back a surge of panic. She focused on the sound of Sam's movements just ahead of her, the steady scrape of his boots on the rock. He was her guide, her compass in the dark. After what seemed like an eternity, the tunnel began to widen. They could stand, though they had to stoop. Sam lit a small tallow lamp he'd taken from his satchel, and the flickering light revealed an incredible sight. The walls of the cavern were covered in crystals that glittered like a million stars. And on the walls, drawn in charcoal and ochre, were ancient paintings, stick figures of men hunting massive beasts, symbols of suns and moons, and handprints hundreds of them, covering the walls like a silent, watching crowd. My ancestors, Sam whispered, his voice filled with reverence. They used this place for ceremonies, a place of refuge. It felt like a sacred place, a world away from the violence they were fleeing. For a moment they were safe, but then a low rumble echoed from the way they had come. It started as a vibration in the soles of their feet and grew into a deep, guttural roar. What was that? Rose gasped. Sam's face was pale in the lamplight. They found the entrance, he said, his voice grim, and they're not coming in after us. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the very rock around them. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. Dynamite, Sam yelled over the noise. They're going to collapse the tunnel. Run! The world exploded in a deafening roar. The force of the blast threw them off their feet, slamming them against the cavern wall. The lamp flew from Sam's hand and extinguished, plunging them back into absolute darkness. Rocks and dirt showered down from above, the air filled with choking dust. Rose coughed, her ears ringing, her head spinning. Sam! She screamed into the blackness. Sam, are you okay? She heard a groan nearby. I'm here, he rasped. Are you hurt? I don't think so, she said, pulling herself up. She fumbled in her pockets for the small flint and steel Sam had given her. Her hands were shaking so badly it took her several tries, but finally a spark caught on a piece of tinder. She blew it gently into a flame and lit the lamp again. The sight the light revealed made her gasp. A massive pile of rock and rubble completely blocked the tunnel behind them. They were trapped. They sealed it, she breathed, a new, horrifying wave of claustrophobia washing over her. They buried us alive. Sam pushed himself to his feet, wincing as he put weight on his left leg. He moved to the rockfall, running his hands over the tightly packed debris. They did a thorough job, he said, his voice grim. He looked back at her, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes dark with worry. We can't go back. So we go forward, Rose said, her voice firmer than she felt. You said the tunnel comes out on the other side of the ridge. Is there another way out? Sam nodded slowly. There is, but the path is not easy. And my leg, he gestured down. In the lamplight, she could see a dark stain spreading through the fabric of his trousers, just below the knee. A jagged piece of rock had gashed his leg open. It was bleeding freely. The situation had gone from desperate to dire. They were trapped deep underground, with limited light, no food, and one of them was badly injured. And even if they did find a way out, Sterling's men would be waiting for them. It was a perfect trap. Let me see, Rose said, tearing a strip of cloth from the hem of her dress. She knelt and gently examined the wound. It was deep, a nasty gash that was still oozing blood. We have to stop the bleeding. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. She cleaned the wound as best she could with water from their canteen and bound it tightly with the makeshift bandage. Sam watched her, his expression a mixture of pain and something else, admiration. Your mother was a healer too, he said quietly. She knew all the old remedies. The reminder of her mother gave Rose strength. What would she have done? She wouldn't have panicked. She would have made a plan. Okay, Rose said, standing up. We can't stay here. You need to lean on me. We'll go slow. Sam protested, but she was insistent. He was bigger and stronger, but he was hurt. Now it was her turn to lead. He finally relented, draping an arm over her shoulders. They started forward, moving deeper into the earth, their single lamp casting long, fearful shadows ahead of them. The tunnel system was a labyrinth. It split into multiple passages, some leading to dead ends, others to vast, cathedral-like caverns dripping with stalactites. Without Sam's knowledge, they would have been hopelessly lost in minutes. He directed her, his voice low and strained with pain, relying on memory and the subtle changes in the airflow. The air grew colder, and the silence was absolute, broken only by their footsteps and the steady drip, drip, drip of water. Hours passed. Rose's shoulders ached from supporting Sam's weight. His breathing was becoming more ragged, and she knew he was developing a fever. The bandage around his leg was soaked through with blood. They had to get out, soon. Finally, they entered a massive cavern. In the center, a deep, dark pool of water blocked their path. "We're almost there," Sam rasped, his voice weak. "The exit is on the other side of the pool." "How do we get across?" Rose asked, looking at the black, still water. "We swim." Swimming was out of the question for Sam in his condition, and Rose couldn't carry him. It looked hopeless. Then she saw it. Tucked away in a small alcove near the water's edge was a small, crudely made raft, little more than a few logs lashed together with vines. It looked ancient. "Your ancestors?" she asked. Sam managed a weak nod. They used it for their ceremonies. It was their only chance. They managed to get the raft into the water and carefully climbed aboard. It barely held their weight, sinking until the icy water lapped at the edges. Using a piece of driftwood as a paddle, Rose began to push them across the silent, underground lake. The lamplight barely penetrated the darkness, reflecting off the water and making it impossible to see how deep it was. The silence was unnerving. Halfway across, a sound made Rose freeze, a soft plop in the water near the raft. Then another. She held the lamp out over the water. A pair of pale, milky white eyes blinked back at her from just beneath the surface before disappearing into the black depths. "What was that?" she whispered, her heart hammering. "Cave fish," Sam murmured, his eyes half closed. "Blind. Harmless." But a moment later the raft jolted, struck by something from below. Something big. The fish weren't alone down there. Something else lived in the lake. Something much, much larger. Rose paddled faster, her muscles screaming in protest. The raft lurched again, more violently this time, and a thick, pale tentacle snaked out of the water and slapped against the logs, inches from her hand. It wasn't a fish. She didn't know what it was, but it was hunting them. With a final, desperate push, the raft bumped against the far shore. They scrambled onto the rocky bank, just as the raft was pulled back into the water with a violent splash and dragged under, disappearing into the blackness. They had made it, just barely. Ahead of them was a steep, narrow passage, and from the end of it, Rose could feel a faint, cool breeze on her face, a breeze that smelled of pine and night air. It was the way out. They emerged from the cave into the dead of night, high on a mountain ridge. The air was thin and bitingly cold. Below them, the entire valley was spread out like a dark blanket pricked with a few tiny lights. They were free from the tunnel, but they were far from safe. Sam collapsed, his fever now raging. He was shivering violently, his skin hot to the touch. The wound in his leg was badly infected. He needed medicine, a real doctor. And the only doctor was in town, the very place they couldn't go. Rose built a small, smokeless fire in a sheltered rock crevice and made him as comfortable as she could. She knew if she didn't get him help, he would die. And if he died, she would be alone. The journal, the truth, their entire mission, it would all die with him. She looked down at the town, a place she had once called home, now the heart of the enemy's territory. It was suicide to go down there. Sterling's men would be everywhere, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. But what other choice did she have? She couldn't leave Sam to die. Looking at his pale, feverish face, she realized something with startling clarity. This wasn't just about justice for her mother anymore. It was about him. He had saved her, protected her, trusted her. She wouldn't abandon him. She had to take the risk. She would go into the lion's den. Before she left, she took the journal from the satchel. She couldn't risk taking it with her. She found a loose rock in the cave wall, wrapped the precious book in a piece of oilskin, and hid it deep inside the crevice. It would be safe there. She took the pistol, a knife, and a small pouch of coins Sam had in the satchel. She gently brushed the hair from his forehead. "I'll be back," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her. "I promise." Then she turned and began the long, dangerous climb down the mountain toward the hostile lights of the town below. Every step was a gamble. Every shadow could be hiding an enemy. She was no longer a scared girl running from a monster. She was a hunter, walking right into its lair. The town was a ghost of what she remembered. It was quiet, but it was a tense, watchful quiet. Men stood in shadowed doorways, their eyes following her as she walked down the main street, her shawl pulled low over her face. Sterling had the place locked down. She avoided the main mercantile and went to the back door of the town doctor's house. She knew him. He was an old, timid man, but he was kind. She prayed he wasn't on Sterling's payroll. She knocked softly. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and Dr. Miller peered out, his eyes wide with fear when he saw who it was. "Rose? My dear girl, you shouldn't be here. They're looking for you everywhere. I need your help," she pleaded, keeping her voice low. "It's not for me. There's a man up in the hills. He's badly hurt. An infection. He'll die without medicine." The doctor wrung his hands, his gaze darting nervously up and down the alley. "I can't. If the judge found out I helped you—" "He won't find out," Rose insisted. "Please, he saved my life. You're a doctor. You took an oath." The old man was terrified, but the mention of his oath struck a chord. He hesitated, then sighed, a look of grim resignation on his face. "All right," he whispered. "Get inside, quickly." He gave her what she needed: laudanum for the pain, carbolic acid to clean the wound, and fresh bandages. As he was packing the bag, he looked at her, his expression full of pity. "Your father has been telling everyone you've gone mad," he said softly. "He says that Apache fellow kidnapped you, filled your head with lies." "My father is a liar and a murderer," Rose said, her voice cold and hard. The doctor flinched but didn't argue. He pressed a small, heavy bag into her hands. "Here," he said, "for your journey. Now go, and may God have mercy on you, child." She slipped out the back door and into the darkness, her heart pounding with a small victory. She had the medicine. Now she just had to get back up the mountain without being caught. She was halfway down the alley when she heard the voices. She ducked behind a stack of rain barrels, her breath catching in her throat. Two of Sterling's men were approaching, their spurs jingling in the quiet street. "Can't have gone far," one of them was saying. "The judge wants her found, and he wants her alive, for now." "And the Apache?" the other asked. "The judge wants him dead. No questions asked." They stopped at the end of the alley, directly under the only lantern. Rose was trapped. She couldn't go forward, and she couldn't go back. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to will herself invisible. One of the men pulled out a cheroot and struck a match. In the brief flare of light, his eyes swept the alley, and they locked directly onto hers. For a split second, nobody moved. The man's eyes widened in surprise. Then his mouth opened to yell. Rose didn't think. She acted. She drew the pistol Sam had given her, the one she'd prayed she would never have to use. She fired. The explosion was deafening in the narrow alley. The man grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder, not his mouth. She hadn't aimed to kill, only to silence. The other man was fumbling for his own gun, but she was already moving. She sprinted out of the alley, leaving the bag of medicine behind in her panic, and ran down the main street. Doors flew open. Men shouted. A full-blown alarm was raised. She was exposed, a running target in the middle of the town. She wouldn't make it to the mountains. They would catch her within a minute. She needed a place to hide, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. Her eyes darted around, and then she saw it. The church. Its tall, dark steeple rose against the starry sky. It was her only chance. She ran up the stone steps and threw her weight against the heavy oak doors. They were unlocked. She slipped inside, plunging the heavy bolt home just as the first of her pursuers reached the steps. The church was vast and silent, smelling of old wood and cold stone. Moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the empty pews in ghostly colors. She was safe for a moment, but they knew where she was. They would surround the building. There was no escape. She had failed. She'd lost the medicine. She was trapped, and Sam was going to die on the mountain. Despair washed over her. She sank onto a pew, the heavy pistol still warm in her hand. It was over. And then she heard a floorboard creak in the darkness near the altar. She wasn't alone. She raised the pistol, her hands shaking. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice echoing in the huge empty space. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a woman, old and frail, dressed in black. She was holding a single candle, its flame illuminating a face etched with worry and sorrow. It was Mrs. Wilson, the quiet widow who lived next to the church, the woman her mother had sometimes mentioned in her journal. Child, the old woman whispered, her voice trembling. What have you done? They're trying to kill me, Rose said, the words tumbling out. They killed my mother, Judge Sterling, and my father. They're monsters, and no one will believe me. Mrs. Wilson came closer, her eyes full of a deep, ancient sadness. I believe you, she said softly. Rose stared at her. What? I knew your mother well, Mrs. Wilson said, her voice gaining strength. She was the bravest woman I ever met, and I know what she was doing. I know about the journal. Rose was stunned into silence. How could she know? Before she died, the old woman continued, her voice cracking. She came to me. She was afraid. She told me that if anything ever happened to her, she had left proof. And she told me that she had entrusted a second key to that proof with someone she trusted completely. Mrs. Wilson reached into the bodice of her black dress and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She gave this to me, she said, her hands shaking as she held it out. It's a letter, in her own hand, naming Judge Sterling and your father as her future murderers and explaining the code in her journal. She made me swear to give it to the authorities if she died. Then why didn't you? Rose cried, a new hope surging through her. Why have you kept this secret all these years? Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears. Fear, she whispered, her voice full of self-loathing. I was a coward. Sterling. He ruined my husband. He took everything from us. I knew what he was capable of. I was afraid he would kill me too. So I hid it. I stayed silent. I let an innocent woman's murder go unanswered. Outside, the shouting grew louder. They were trying to break down the door. But tonight, Mrs. Wilson said, her eyes finding a new fire. Tonight, seeing you, hearing that gunshot, I knew I couldn't hide anymore. Your mother's courage lives in you, child, and you have shamed my cowardice. She pressed the letter into Rose's hand. This letter, combined with the journal, is undeniable proof. You can't be dismissed as a crazy girl. This is her testimony from beyond the grave. The heavy oak doors shuddered as a heavy log was slammed against them. They wouldn't hold for long. There's a priest's tunnel, Mrs. Wilson said urgently, pointing toward the altar. It leads to my cellar. We can escape. It was a miracle, a second chance. They had the final piece of the puzzle, but then Rose remembered. The journal, she said, her heart sinking. I left it. It's hidden in a cave, up on the mountain. And Sam was up there too, dying. The doors groaned, the wood splintering. They had seconds. Then we have no choice, Mrs. Wilson said, her face set with a new hard resolve. We must go back up that mountain. The tunnel was old and smelled of damp earth and incense. It let them out into Mrs. Wilson's cellar, right under the noses of the men surrounding the church. From there, they slipped out the back of her small house and into the network of gardens and alleys that the old woman knew like the back of her hand. She was surprisingly agile, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. She led Rose out of the town limits, and they began the arduous climb back up the mountain, hidden by the darkness. Sterling ruined my husband, Mrs. Wilson explained in a hushed, angry voice as they climbed. He was a partner in the original land grant. Sterling forged papers, bribed a judge, and took everything. It broke him. He died a year later. Your mother was the only one who knew the truth, the only one who tried to help. The story poured out of her, a poison that had been kept inside for too long. Rose listened, her own anger solidifying into a cold, clear purpose. This wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about justice. For her mother, for Sam's family, for the Wilsons, for every person the judge had trampled on his way to power. They found Sam where she had left him. His fever was worse and he was delirious, muttering in a language she didn't understand. Mrs. Wilson, it turned out, knew a great deal about herbs and poultices, skills she'd learned from her own mother. While Rose retrieved the journal, the old woman cleaned and dressed Sam's wound with remedies she'd gathered on the climb. He's strong, she said, looking at Sam's unconscious form. But he needs a real doctor, and soon. We don't have much time. They had the journal. They had the letter. They had everything they needed to expose Sterling. But they were still trapped on a mountain with a dying man and an army of killers searching for them. How could they possibly get the evidence to the right people? The federal marshal was still 100 miles away. "We don't have to take the evidence to the law," Rose said, a daring, desperate plan forming in her mind. "We'll bring the law to the evidence." "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Wilson asked. "Judge Sterling is giving a speech tomorrow," Rose said, the plan coming together with a frightening clarity. "At the Founding Day picnic, the whole town will be there. The mayor, the council, everyone. He'll be standing on that podium, talking about progress and prosperity. He'll feel safe, untouchable." "You can't be thinking of confronting him there," Mrs. Wilson gasped. "He'll have you shot before you can say a word." "I won't be the one confronting him," Rose said, a grim smile on her face. "My mother will be." The plan was insane. It was reckless. It was their only shot. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Rose, guided by Mrs. Wilson, copied key pages from the journal onto fresh sheets of paper. They focused on the most damning evidence: the falsified land deeds, the records of bribery, and, most importantly, the detailed coded entry about the night Sam's family home was burned down. An entry that specifically named Judge Sterling and her father Whitmore as the ones who lit the torch. They attached her mother's letter to the front of these pages. It was a powder keg, just waiting for a spark. As dawn broke, Sam's fever finally broke. He was weak but lucid. Rose explained the plan to him. He watched her, his gray eyes full of a fierce pride. "It's dangerous," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "He will kill you without a second thought." "Let him try," Rose said. "I'm not the same girl who knocked on your door 3 nights ago." She leaned down and pressed a canteen to his lips. "You rest. Mrs. Wilson will stay with you. I have to do this alone." "No," he said, trying to sit up. "You don't." But he was too weak. He fell back, his face pale. "I am so tired of running," Rose said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Today we stop running. Today we fight back." She kissed him on the forehead, a promise and a goodbye all in one. Then she took the packet of papers, tucked them securely in her dress, and began her descent toward the town for the final time. She was walking back into the fire, but this time she was carrying the flood. The town square was buzzing with people. Bunting was draped from the rooftops, and a large podium had been set up in front of the courthouse. The Founding Day picnic was in full swing. Rose moved through the crowd, her shawl pulled low, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw Sterling's men scattered everywhere, their eyes scanning the faces, looking for her. She saw Sheriff Gable standing near the podium, looking proud and important. And she saw her father standing near the back, a bottle hidden in a paper bag in his hand, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. She made her way to the one place she knew she could find a friendly face: the bakery. Old Mr. Henderson, the baker, had been a friend of her mother's. He was a good man who despised Judge Sterling, but was too afraid to speak out. Rose slipped in the back door. The baker's eyes went wide when he saw her. Before he could speak, she pressed a finger to her lips and handed him a small folded note. "Please," she whispered, "for my mother. Give this to the telegraph operator. Tell him it's a matter of life and death." The baker read the note, his face paling. It was a short, urgent message addressed to the federal marshal in the next territory, summarizing Sterling's crimes and requesting immediate assistance. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. The baker looked from the note to Rose's desperate face. He saw the same fire he used to see in her mother's eyes. He nodded once, tucked the note in his pocket, and left without a word. Rose had done all she could. Now it was time for the main event. She slipped back into the crowd just as Judge Sterling was climbing the steps to the podium. He was a big man, dressed in a fine suit, his face beaming with false sincerity. He raised his hands for silence, and the crowd quieted. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice booming across the square. "On this glorious founding day, we look at the prosperity around us. A prosperity built on hard work, shared values, and the rule of law." As he spoke, Rose began to move. She didn't head for the podium. She headed for the church bell tower. It was the highest point in the town square. From there, everyone would be able to hear her. She climbed the winding stairs, her legs shaking. the packet of her mother's words clutched in her hand. She reached the top just as Sterling was finishing his speech. She took a deep breath, and then she began to read. "My name is Sarah Whitmore," she shouted, her voice amplified by the height, carrying clear across the entire square. "And if you are hearing these words, it is because Judge Sterling and my husband, Thomas Whitmore, have murdered me." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Every head turned, looking up at the lone figure in the bell tower. Judge Sterling froze mid-sentence, his face turning from a confident smile to a mask of pure fury. "On the night of October the 12th, Rose continued, her voice growing stronger, "Judge Sterling paid my husband to help him burn the Apache camp at Willow Creek." She didn't stop. She read the copied pages, her voice ringing with the power of her mother's truth. She read about the land grabs, the bribes, the murders. With every word, the crowd grew more agitated. People started murmuring, pointing, looking from the bell tower to the podium where Sterling stood, his face a thundercloud. "Seize her!" Sterling roared at Sheriff Gable. "That girl is insane. Shoot her if you have to." The sheriff and his deputies drew their guns and started running toward the church. But the crowd was starting to turn. Men who had lost their farms, women whose husbands had been cheated. They started to move, forming a human wall between the deputies and the church. They weren't sure if they believed the girl, but they had hated Sterling for years, and this was the crack in his armor they had been waiting for. In the chaos, Rose read the final, most damning part of her mother's letter. "And I leave this testimony so that the truth may one day be known. May God have mercy on their souls, for the town will surely not." She finished, her voice raw. Then she took the pages, her mother's last will and testament, and let them fly from the tower. They fluttered down like white doves, scattering into the shocked and angry crowd below. The town square erupted into chaos. Fights broke out between Sterling's men and the townsfolk. Sheriff Gable was swarmed, disarmed by a group of angry farmers. It was a full-blown riot. Judge Sterling, seeing his power crumble before his very eyes, pulled a pistol from his coat and fired into the crowd, trying to clear a path to escape. But then, a single shot rang out from a different direction, from the rooftop of the building across the square. Sterling cried out and staggered, clutching a bloody hole in his shoulder. He looked up. Standing on the edge of the roof, his hunting rifle smoking, was Sam. He was pale and leaning against a chimney for support, but he was there. Mrs. Wilson stood beside him, helping him stay upright. They had come down the mountain after all. They wouldn't let Rose face this alone. Cornered, wounded, and defeated, Judge Sterling turned to the one person he thought he still controlled. "Whitmore!" he screamed at Rose's father, who was cowering near the edge of the crowd. "Help me! Do something!" Rose's father looked from the enraged faces of his neighbors to the cold, murderous eyes of the judge. He looked up at the bell tower where his daughter stood, a living monument to the wife he had helped kill, and in that moment something inside him finally broke. She's telling the truth," he stammered, his voice cracking. "All of it. He made me do it. He made me help him kill her." It was the final nail in the coffin. The confession hung in the air, sealing Sterling's fate. The crowd surged forward, a wave of righteous fury, and dragged the judge from the podium. It was over. The lie that had held the valley captive for so long had been shattered. The aftermath was swift. The federal marshal, summoned by the baker's telegram, arrived the next day to find Judge Sterling and Sheriff Gable locked in their own jail cells. Rose's father, having given a full confession, was taken into federal custody. The town was in shock, but it was also cleansing. The poison had been drawn out. Sam and Rose watched from the window of Dr. Miller's office, where Sam was recovering from his wound. The valley below looked different now, cleaner, freer. Mrs. Wilson took over the running of the town council, her fear replaced by a quiet, steely authority. The stolen lands were, piece by piece, returned to their rightful owners. A week later, Sam and Rose stood on the hill where his cabin used to be. There was nothing left but a blackened patch of earth and a stone chimney, standing like a tombstone. "We can rebuild," Rose said softly, slipping her hand into his. He looked down at their joined hands, then out at the valley. The anger in his eyes, the deep old pain she'd seen on that first night, was gone. In its place was a quiet peace. My mother used to say, he said, his voice low, that some storms come not to disrupt your life, but to clear your path. He turned to her, and for the first time, he smiled, a true, real smile that reached his gray eyes and transformed his face. Our path is clear now. They didn't have a home, but it didn't matter. They had each other. They had the truth. And for the first time, they had a future. They walked down the hill, not as fugitives or avengers, but as survivors. Two lonely souls who had found each other in the heart of a storm, and together had found the strength to calm the wind and bring the sun. And that's where their story truly begins. It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single voice, armed with the truth, can be enough to start an avalanche. It proves that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. If you were moved by Rose and Sam's story, and if you believe in the power of truth and justice, do me a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We've got so many more stories like this to share, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thanks for listening.